Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second lecture on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Now, in the previous lecture, we had dealt with what kind of influence the um, Enlightenment had on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and today we are going to talk about a little bit of Mary Shelley's own life, which influenced the text itself. Especially, we'll be talking about the background where Mary Shelley conceived of the text. Now, Mary Shelley's father, William Godwin, and her mother, Lady Mary Wollstonecraft, played a major role in her conception of the text of Frankenstein itself. Now, on the one hand, Lady Mary Wollstonecraft, in her Vindication of the Rights of Women, had proposed that women must be educated. Because you see, Lady Mary Wollstonecraft was worried about the sorry situation of education in her own times, especially for women. And she said that uh, women are not intelligent as men in her times, and it does not come as a surprise because women are not educated properly. And since they are not educated properly, therefore they cannot have an opinion in matters which transcend the periphery of the home. And therefore she said that educate a woman, because if you teach a woman that from her very early childhood, if you teach her that you are supposed to get married, you are supposed to seek a good husband, you are supposed to learn about the household chores, then it is natural that she would be only focusing on her external beauty and her nature, which would seek her a good husband. But if you actually educate her in the proper ways of life, then what will happen is that she will have an opinion. She will develop a thought process with which she would be able to understand that what is her actual role in society. Now, although Wollstonecraft was a product of her own times, but and therefore she suggested that if you teach a woman properly, then she would accept those roles better. But still, we must understand that Wollstonecraft was a staunch advocate for women's education, and back in those days, this was a big deal. Now, her husband, William Godwin, was a very problematic character because you see, he had a very scandalous life and he had affairs and all, and he ran into a huge debt. Now, the poet Percy Shelley was a good friend of the family, and Shelley and Mary Shelley were in a relationship back in that time. Now, during this time, Godwin had undergone a huge financial debt, and he thought that Shelley would help him to get rid of this financial debt. And when Shelley's family declared that they are not going to give Shelley anything, so Godwin kind of forced Shelley that you should get a huge loan in exchange for the part of the family heirloom that you are going to get. And on 6th July of 1814, Shelley signed papers which secured him a huge loan, but on a very nasty amount of interest. And part of this loan was going to be to alleviate Godwin's own financial debts. And the two, that is Shelley and Godwin, they went on a long walk. Now, in his book Political Justice, Godwin had advocated for love relationships out of marriage, that is, before marriage and etc. And even he had a very interesting life with Lady Mary Wollstonecraft before their marriage. And Shelley told Godwin about his own affair with his daughter, Mary, in the hopes that Godwin would understand and bless the communion. However, Godwin was furious. He threatened Shelley, he threatened Mary that they were not to meet each other. Shelley was barred from entering the Godwin household, and so on and so forth. But Mary declared that she would be faithful to Shelley, although she would not communicate with him, or she would not make him get any form of positive approach from her side. And Godwin thought that here rests the matter. But it was far from over. And one fine afternoon, Shelley forced himself into the schoolroom with a gun, a pistol, and a bottle of laudanum. And he said that they wish to separate us, my beloved, but death shall unite us. Now, it was true that Mary was afraid, but still he calmed Shelley down and she sent him home. On that very same night, there was a bell at midnight in the Godwin household with the news that Shelley had taken an overdose of laudanum and he was about to die. So the Godwins rushed out to save Shelley while Mary stayed back at home panicking. But Shelley survived the attempt, and everybody thought that, all right, things are getting heated right now. On 28th July of 1814, Shelley waited outside Skinner Street with a carriage. While inside the house, Mary packed her belongings and left a note in Godwin's study, and they left at 4 a.m. And Mary walked out of 41 Skinner Street to the waiting carriage, which sped to France from Dover. Now, Claire Claremont decided that she would accompany the pair because she was the only one who knew how to speak French. And Mary Shelley exclaims in Frankenstein, we were on a voyage of discovery, and they were discovering themselves. And you see, a few days after arriving in France, Claire Claremont, Mary, and P.B. Shelley, the three of them started maintaining a joint diary, which did not just comment about Shelley and Mary's initial years, but also commented about much of the stuff of Frankenstein's initial material. So, a history of a 6 week tour proved to be a substance for Frankenstein itself. And the first 2 years of their journey is replete with much of the material that finally made itself to the pages of Frankenstein. Now, when they came to France and they visited Switzerland from there, most of Europe was closed to tourists because of the 20 years of war, starting from the French Revolution to the Napoleonic Wars. And they faced a lot of obstacles in their way, starting from monetary obstacles because they did not have a lot of money, to uncooperative means of traveling. But during this journey, they took a boat via the river Rhine. And in this river journey, along the river, they passed several crumbling castles. And in early September of 1814, they made a significant overnight stop at Gernsheim, just below Darmstadt, which is and a hill on top of which there stood a castle. And the name of the castle is very interesting. The name of the castle is Castle Frankenstein. Now, the significance of the castle served as an inspiration for Mary's novel, and there are certainly coincidences and potential sources of inspiration that Mary's novel uh, has had from this castle. Now, Castle Frankenstein was built in the 13th century by Lord Conrad II Reis von Beerberg, who, after building the castle, changed his name to von Frankenstein. Frankenstein simply means stone of the Franks, and it would be a common way of naming an area owned by the Franks family, which was a very common German name. By the 17th century, the castle had become a refuge and a hospital for those fleeing the war with France. On 10th August of 1673, two refugees staying at the castle become the parents of the castle's most notorious inhabitant, Johann Conrad Dippel. And Dippel grew up to become a professional alchemist and was rumored by the locals to have sold his soul to the devil in a Faustian pact for some material gain. Now, rumors abound about Dippel and his experiments, including stories that he found the Philosopher's Stone and had experimented with transferring souls. Now, whether he actually carried out this particular experiment is unknown, but he wrote on uh, he wrote about his experiments in one of his books, Maladies and Remedies of the Life of the Flesh. And here he writes about how and with what aid, that is, aid of a funnel, a soul could be transferred from one corpse to another. And Dippel became interested in alchemy and in medicine when he was studying at Göttingen in 1698. And one of his professors described Dippel as an unintelligible writer who was an alchemist, who was a chemist into the bargain, and whose brain seems to have been heated to a high degree of fermentation by the fire laboratory. Now, around 1700, Dippel began investigating potential new medicines and he focused his interest on animals. He produced an oil from the destructive distillation of animals and their parts, and the medical use of animals and even human parts already had a long history by the 18th century, and many boasted of their benefits. Now, the French chemist Pierre Joseph Macquer wrote that animal oils had an excellent reputation in medicine. Peter Shaw, a physician and medical writer in the 18th century, described them as good in fevers and grateful to the nerves. And Dippel claimed that his oil was not just good for minor maladies, but that it was also a universal medicine capable of curing all diseases and even exorcising demons. He devoted a large portion of his MD thesis in discussing his oil's properties. Now, among the experiments on corpses and attempts to turn the base metals into gold, Dippel made a genuinely valuable contribution to modern science, though it is owed more to chance than to design. In 1704, Dippel was living in Berlin, where a printmaker, Johann Jakob Diesbach, was making red lake pigment from cochineal, and Diesbach borrowed some salt of tartar from Dippel, who used it to produce his animal oil. Now, when the salt was added to Diesbach's cochineal process, instead of the expected red color, a deep blue pigment was produced, and the pigment was named burning blue. And later, when it was used to dye the uniforms of the Prussian army, it was called Prussian blue. Now, this pigment has been used by artists, printers, and photographers, as well as in medicines to treat uh, thallium poisoning and by pathologists as a stain to identify the presence of iron. Now, Dippel's work was of medical benefit, and although not in the way that he had predicted. Now, after studying medicine from the university at Leiden, he graduated in 1711 and set up medical practice near Amsterdam. However, just 3 years later, he found himself imprisoned on the Danish island of Bornholm for his suspected involvement in uh, a series of political intrigues. Now, the remainder of his life was spent in Sweden and in northern Germany, and he was employed by the Duke of Wittgenstein Gustow and was provided with a laboratory at the Duke's castle. It was here that on 25th April of 1734 he was found dead at the age of 60, just months after he had predicted that he would live for another 74 years. Now, some friends claimed that he had been poisoned, perhaps deliberately by those who wanted to steal his alchemical secrets, or accidentally because of the state of his laboratory, but probably he died of stroke. Now, the ruins of the Gothic castle Frankenstein were a very popular tourist destination in Shelley's day. Tales of a resident alchemist carrying out macabre experiments on human cadavers can only have added to the attraction, as you understand. Now, it seems that the obvious inspiration for Frankenstein, except that despite traveling within 10 miles of the castle and stopping at the nearby town of Mainz and Mannheim for several hours, there is absolutely no evidence that Mary ever visited the castle itself. If she heard stories about the castle and its sinister occupants, which is quite possible if she talked to the local people or fellow travelers on the boat, Mary made no mention of it in her diary or in any other of her writings. She may have read about Dipple and his experiments, but we cannot find any definite link. The parallels, however, are very interesting and very potent to have actually been missed. Now, uh, so you see this first part of Shelley's life with Mary and their travel to Switzerland and to the other places of Europe were very interesting. But things soon took a devastating turn because Shelley was borrowing money from everywhere. And Claire Claremont was getting a bit anxious to live with the Shelleys because she did not want to become the latch on in the couple's journey. And in 1815, she separated herself from the couple. However, she returned in early 1816 after living apart for 9 months from the Shelley couple. Uh, she returned to them at Bishopgate, perhaps tired of being the shadow of her stepsister's romantic outlaw life. She decided to have an adventure of her own. But during this time, the Shelleys had made with somebody who was very special. That was George Gordon, Lord Byron. And she had set her eyes on Byron, and Byron was at his height of fame during that time. And he was separated from his wife and daughter as well. Now, Claire established a correspondence with the poet, and Byron was very famous or infamous back in those days because of his uh, own life and of his very interesting love affairs. Now, the Shelley and the Byron families started living together during this time, And Shelley and Byron met during this time in 1815 or 1816, and actually it was 1816. I have just remembered the date. Uh, Byron was there in Germany, and Shelley went to meet him there. Uh, they first met each other on 27th May of 1816 in Geneva, in Hotel Secheron d'Angleterre, and they met on the hotel's jetty. And Shelley had just returned from a fishing trip on the lake, and Byron and Shelley set out a great friendship from the very beginning. Now, they started spending more time together, and the Shelley party rented a small villa nearby called Maison Chapius, and Byron, still at Secheron, would row across the lake to visit them in the evenings. Now, on 10th June, Byron moved towards the much grander villa called Villa Diodati, just a 10 minutes walk through the vineyards from Maison Chapius. And Claire would take great advantage of this opportunity. Now, Byron kept unusual hours, getting up around midday and going for long rides on horseback and writing or entertaining until uh, the very late hours of night. Now, it was very difficult, but the Shelleys adapted themselves to Byron's timetable. Now, they would rise at an earlier hour but spend their mornings reading and studying, as was their custom, to leave themselves free to spend time in Byron's company later in the day. Now, local gossip soon spread about the two households and how much time they were spending in each other's company. And an enterprising hotelier across the lake bought even telescopes, which he set up in the balcony of his hotel so that tourists could look out at what was going on in Villa Diodati. Excuse me. Now, it was a very weird time, and CCTV aunties were everywhere. So, this is a very problematic uh, situation if you think about it in that light. So, during that time, even women wearing petticoats became news. So, you can very well understand that what are the problems of that period. Now, each period has its own issues and its own problems, and this was not something which was not there in the Romantic period. Now, here at Villa Diodati, the four gathered, and Mary Shelley writes in her journal, Fran, in third bracket, Kens, comes. So here on 17th June, Byron made a challenge that they should write a ghost story. All of them should write a ghost story. Okay, and now this is the beginning of the entire fiasco of Frankenstein. And the wet weather and the spooky stories continued over the following nights, fueling the imaginations of the writers. But there was another character whose name was Polidori, and Polidori wrote his in his diary on 17th June. The ghost stories are begun by all but me. But of the five stories that were started, only two were ever completed. And to everyone's surprise, it was not the established writers Byron and Shelley who made the most lasting contributions. Byron's challenge may have produced much in quantity, but a simple, light-hearted challenge to alleviate the boredom of the miserable summer produced two of the most recognizable figures in Gothic horror fiction. Frankenstein's monster, and the vampire. So the group continued to gather in the evenings at the Villa Diodati, and just after a few days after the writing competition had begun on June 18th, the supernatural theme continued, and Byron read aloud Coleridge's Christabel during this time, an unfinished poem with a strong supernatural horror theme to the assembled party. At one point, Shelley began shrieking and ran away from the room, and Polidori went after him to calm him down. Byron was astonished at Shelley's reaction to the poem, for he don't want courage. And Shelley loved late night supernatural frights. He and Claire, after Mary had gone to bed, would often stay up, terrifying each other with ghost stories until Claire's imagination ran away with her and she became too scared to sleep. Now, Mary was the composed one and the reliable one of the trio, and it would normally be her who was called upon to soothe Claire. In her introduction to the 1831 edition of Frankenstein, Mary claimed that it was not for several days after the challenge that inspiration came. Then one night, perhaps the night of the reading of Christabel, Mary had a frightening waking dream, and she writes about it. She says, I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then on the working of some powerful engine show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half vital motion. Now, maybe the reading of Christabel had a greater impact on her than she ever cared to admit, and the fear she had experienced in her dream was exactly the kind of feeling that she had been trying to capture in her story. And therefore, she soon started writing about her dream. Now, a similar thing had happened with Coleridge when he was writing Kubla Khan, which has a dream origin. And Horace Walpole also claimed that the castle of Otranto, the first and the hugely impactful work of Gothic fiction, had its roots in dreams as well. Now, Mary would have been reluctant to compare herself with Coleridge or with Walpole, but basically, she initially made no reference to the dream when Frankenstein was first published in 1818. Now, when she came to write the introduction to the 1831 edition, she basically was referring finally to the dream roots of the narrative found at Villa Diodati. Now, whatever really happened over those few nights on the shore of the Lake Geneva, the results were spectacular, we must agree, and rather unexpected as well. And Mary's was the only story perhaps, which made a full length novel, and it is the one which has survived and thrived for over 2 centuries now. However, much enthusiasm surrounded Byron's initial proposal. It soon waned, and Byron didn't write much. So, and there is no mention of Claire's story, what it was about, and how much progress she had made with it. The two established writers, Shelley and Byron, both started stories, but none of them completed them. And Shelley's story apparently drew on his childhood experiences, but nothing has survived. And Byron's fragment of a story was appended to his poem Mazeppa when it was published in 1819. And Mary talks of poor Polidori writing a tale of a skull headed lady, and he may have started with the idea, but nothing came out of it. However, Polidori, contrary to Mary's account in the introduction, took up Byron's discarded tale and reworked it into a story. Now, it was uh, published either uh, it was published unknown to either Byron or to Polidori in the new monthly magazine The Vampire in 1819. The Gothic story of an aristocratic vampire, Lord Ruthven, a thinly disguised Byron, and it is credited to be the first modern vampire tale and sparked its own literary subgenre, which was to culminate in the publication of Bram Stoker's Dracula 78 years later. Now, when The Vampire was published, it was initially attributed to Byron himself, but he disclaimed authorship as enthusiastically as Polidori later claimed it when he heard of its publication. The central idea, now let's come back to Frankenstein. The central idea of Frankenstein may have come to Mary Shelley in a waking dream, but the concept of a man brought to life is not an original one. Now, quite apart from the contemporary 18th century scientific accounts of galvanism and spontaneous generation that she acknowledged in her introduction, she had multiple myths and stories to draw upon from her childhood. And Godwin's education of his children paid a lot of attention to the classics of ancient Greece and Rome, and Shelley and Byron were also versed in these. The subtitle of Frankenstein, called The Modern Prometheus, shows how strongly Mary drew upon the classical mythology and folklore for her inspiration. The Prometheus myth would have been taught to her as a child, probably from Godwin's own book, The Pantheon, on Greek and Roman myths. The Prometheus myths exist in two versions. There are two versions to the Prometheus myth. One has Prometheus stealing knowledge from the gods, and the other has him creating a man out of clay and stealing life giving fire to bring his clay man to life. Now, in both versions of the tale, the theft of knowledge or fire outrages the gods. And Prometheus had already displeased Zeus, but this was the last straw, and his punishment was that he was to be chained on the Caucasian mountain and to have a vulture eat out of his liver. Only that the liver would grow back in night, and such a punishment would go on for eternity. Now, the parallels with Frankenstein over here are very, very obvious. That is, a man tortured in perpetuity for having the audacity to transcend the domain of gods in creating life. But Godwin gives a longer account of the legend in the Pantheon, and Mary may have used his additional aspects of the myth to prompt to think about the wider implications of Frankenstein's creation. Now, in the Pantheon, excuse me, Godwin tells that before Prometheus's punishment, Jupiter, the Roman equivalent of the Greek god Zeus, attempted to set a kind of honey trap and ordered Vulcan to create a female creature out of clay. Jupiter gave the female life, and the other gods gave her various attributes and taught her all the finest qualities to make her a most attractive and engaging individual. Now, because of her many gifts, the female creature was named Pandora. Now, Jupiter also gave her a sealed vase that was to be opened by her husband. Now, Pandora was first sent to Prometheus, but he saw through Jupiter's ploy and rejected her. She was then taken to Epimetheus, Prometheus's brother, and Epimetheus fell in love with her and married her. Now, when he opened the vase, all the evils of the world were released, leaving only hope at the bottom. The Prometheus legend was very popular with the Romantic writers, and Mary Shelley was not the only one to use this myth as inspiration. Her own mother, Lady Mary Wollstonecraft, saw the Promethean legend as an important inspiration for women of the Revolution who sought to throw off aristocratic and religious authority. Byron published his poem Prometheus in July of 1816, and Shelley was to write his own interpretation of the Prometheus myth in his epic lyrical drama Prometheus Unbound, which was published in 1820. Now, all of them had their own interpretation of the myth, and many were using it as a political and social metaphor. Now, the ancient Greeks are not very unique in their myths and in the creation of man from clay. Stories of men and other creatures being created from clay or life created from non living matter occur in many cultures around the world. In the Hindu tradition, the elephant headed god Ganesha was created from dirt. Creation of man from clay also occurs in Chinese, Egyptian, and also in Inca mythologies. And Mary was thus tapping into a rich cultural scene, and her story had the potential to resonate throughout the world. And since we are talking about Hindu mythology as well, the concept of Tilottama, that is the lady who was created from all that was good, that is also over here because the creation of Pandora also replicates the creation of Tilottama. And in that way, Mary Shelley was tapping into a lot of different cultural heritages when she was creating her own monster. Now, Jewish stories of the golem also have strong parallels with the Frankensteinian concept, and Mary may well have known about these and used them as inspiration. The golem was a clay figure molded by a rabbi and brought to life to carry out tasks in the household and to benefit the community. However, the story goes that each day the golem grows, and because it becomes more difficult, that is, one day it gets out of control and rages on. Now, there are several versions of the story or several occasions in the Jewish history when a golem has been created, but the most famous is the 16th century golem of Praha. Now, the golem was molded from clay by Rabbi Judah Leo ben Bezalel, and in one version of the tale was brought to life with special incantations and prayers, and by having the word emet, which means truth in Hebrew, written on the creature's forehead. The powerful mute golem had been created to protect the Jewish ghetto in Praha, but he soon got out of control and threatened lives and homes in the Jewish quarter. And Rabbi Liao rushed from the synagogue and erased the first letter of the word in the golem's forehead, and the word now meant met or death, and the creature soon disintegrated. Now, you can already understand that Mary had a lot of raw material in her creation of Frankenstein, and her journal picks up again on 21st July of 1816, over a month after the death of Byron's challenge. And on July 24th, she notes, "Write my story." At the at the time, Mary, Shelley, and Claire were staying at Chamonix in the French Alps and visiting glaciers and other local tourist attractions when the weather permitted. Now, the diary entries are particularly long at this time, and she and Shelley wrote down their impressions of the dramatic landscapes, the mountains, the surroundings, the glaciers, the avalanches, and so on and so forth. And the scenery clearly made a strong impression on Mary, and particularly the glacier Montanvert, now known as Mer de Glace, on the slopes of Mont Blanc. It was here, on the frozen, fragile glacier, that she was to set the dramatic confrontation between Victor Frankenstein and his creation. On 21st August, Mary wrote in her diary, "Shelley and I talk about my story." And Shelley was encouraging her to develop her story into a full length novel. Perhaps they also discussed the general plot and other details as well. And the amount of input Shelley had into the final novel had been hugely debated in the centuries since its publication, and no firm conclusion has been reached. But it would be natural for the couple to discuss their work. Now, the Gothic style of storytelling was already well established in 1816, by books such as The Monk by Matthew Gregory Lewis and the novels of Anne Radcliffe, many of which Mary had already read. Lewis stayed at Villa Diodati for a few days in mid August, and Shelley joined him and Byron to listen to his ghostly tales. Now, these stories made such an impression on Shelley that he recorded them almost verbatim in the journal he shared with Mary. And even Mary's father, William Godwin, had published fictional works, for example, St. Leon, which involved Gothic themes such as alchemy and the secret of the elixir of life, and it is a clear influence on Frankenstein. And Shelley's second attempt at a Gothic novel, St. Irvine, written when he was a teenager, has a gigantic and hideous being which is giving out secret recipes for immortality. However, these works are fantasy and flights of imagination using supernatural or magical phenomena as plot devices. Now, what is surprising about uh, Mary Shelley's work is that despite all the ghostly stories which were told at Villa Diodati, the Gothic novels she enjoyed reading, and the challenge to write a ghost story, that she produced a story which was not in any way a ghost story or a spooky story or a supernatural story. As she wrote in her preface herself, that the event on which the interest of the story depends is exempt from the disadvantages of a mere tale of spectres or enchantment. It is precisely this fact that distinguishes it from the other Gothic horror novels or narratives at work during this time. That is, Mary Shelley was writing science fiction and not a horror story. Now, it also calls into question the uh, inspiration of the Phantasmagoria, Goriana, and Christabel, both of which rely heavily on the supernatural. And Frankenstein stands out as something new and different because it has tapped into contemporary advances in the scientific field, and the terrifying spectacle of the creature brought to life from a collection of dead flesh scavenged from the dissecting rooms and the graveyards was all the more terrifying because it felt too possible and too plausible. If Aristotle had read Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, he would have agreed with it, because Aristotle always said that the improbable but possible should be celebrated rather than the probable but impossible. So the improbable but possible is what is important over here. And therefore, look, she brought her inspiration from one tradition and transfigured it into another tradition which did not even exist back then. So she created her own tradition to talk about narratives taken from another different tradition. And today we use Frankenstein to mean Gothic, mean horror, to mean science fiction, and these things are clubbed together. They are overlapping as if. But Mary Shelley creates a clear cut distinction between these different genres, and that is how she develops a narrative. So, therefore, Frankenstein becomes a very interesting tale. And I do not think that I'll continue today's class for much longer, because we have been asked to keep the classes to manageable lengths for the students. And therefore, I think I'll stop over here today. And in the next class, we will continue with Frankenstein, where we shall talk about the other aspects of the text as well, maybe a little bit more on the composition, and then we shall go into the text itself. So, thank you so much for listening to the lecture. Hope to see you soon with something else. Have a good day.